Hey folks, and welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're taking a look at the TONEZZO ONEz version 2. Now what I just said might make no sense to you if you've never heard of the original TONEZZO ONEz, and that's because they're a fairly obscure brand coming out of Australia, but a brand that you should absolutely be aware of. And the reason I say that is because the original TONEZZO ONEz have been and continue to be one of my favourite all-time IEMs. Now in 2023 they've released the version 2 of the TONEZZO ONEz. And for a price of approximately $370 technically they're 550 Australian dollars. For that price, they're a little bit more expensive than the version 1, but they're also a better IEM. Now some of you might think immediately that I'm biased towards TONEZZO because they're an Aussie company, but as much as I like that these are coming out of Australia, they still have to sound good if they're going to impress me and want to make me say good things about them.
They're lazy, they're so privileged they don't see slavery. Not a hater, not a sexist, I'm just questioning guys and their motives. Things they're doing for themselves in the name of me too. Yeah, they reach out to men. Where's the truth, bro? Where's the koyo? Take my advice, all you feminist guys that do whatever, say whatever to be seen.
As I've already said, you can buy the TONEZZO ONEz for $550, and then there's also the option to buy this additional Bluetooth band, which I'll talk about shortly. And that's at 400 Australian dollars or about $270 extra. Before I go into talking about why it's good, how it compares to some other products, let's talk a bit about what the TONEZZO ONEz version 2 are. These are a hybrid design IEM using a combination of a dynamic driver and then some balanced armatures, and apparently according to TONEZZO, they're using some pretty fancy techniques inside to produce essentially a floating point EQ system internally. Now it's done through passive componentry and crossovers and bits and pieces, so it's not like it's some sort of active, intelligent or powered system, but whatever the magic is that they're working, as I talked about in my original review of the version 1 ones, that's a bit of a mouthful. In that particular review, I talked about the fact that the original ones produced an amazing sense of soundstage clarity in terms of the size and the space within the soundstage. That was nothing short of exceptional, and I can only assume it's down to the way they've designed their crossovers. What makes that unique though is they're being arranged in what's being called a floating hybrid array. Now I've asked Dean multiple times to try to get him to expand a bit on exactly what that means, and understandably he's keeping the technology a little bit close to his chest. What I've been able to glean in talking to him though is that this, as I understand it, is a brand new technology that we've never seen in IEMs before. It's repurposing some of the ideas from the Waves F6 floating EQ plugin that's used by a lot of pro audio engineers and mixers. It's then applying that to the IEMs to make something pretty unique. Now I'll try to explain as best I can how I think it's working in the IEMs, but do keep in mind a lot of this is me pulling together multiple pieces that may or may not actually fit properly together. So take what I'm going to say with somewhat of a grain of salt, but the principles of what I'm going to say are true and accurate to what I'm hearing, and also Dean has confirmed that I'm roughly on the right page. So the way that the Waves F6 plugin works is that it's an EQ that's based on thresholds. What that means is that the EQ only kicks in when a certain threshold of sound is reached. That means that when a certain volume is reached in a certain frequency, you can cut that frequency or you can boost it. It also allows you to do things like identify a frequency such as vocals and have certain other sounds be pulled back a little bit, say the bass frequencies or a kick bass, when the vocals are present. When the vocal is not present, there's no changes made to the kick bass. So the idea being is that it allows you to apply EQ to sound, but only based on the amount of energy coming through at each individual frequency. Now, of course, that's an active software-based plugin, and there's no power going to the ones, so there's no way it can be running an active version of that. And therefore, I'm assuming it's something to do with the way that Dean and the team at TONEZZO have designed the crossover network within the ones that's somehow going to be responding to the threshold of certain frequencies in order to then adjust the sound accordingly. What that means basically is that if what I'm hearing from Dean is accurate, these are constantly adjusting the frequency response slightly to allow the frequencies that are important to our hearing and our musical perception, allowing those frequencies to come through clearly while pulling back a little bit the frequencies that might be masking and altering our perception of the sound. And so when it comes to the version 2, that's all still the same. They're still using the same combination of drivers, albeit some different drivers now, but the same number, the same combination of dynamic driver and balanced armatures. But they're mixing it up by swapping out some of the drivers and then also tuning the earphones just a little bit differently as well. It's a fairly subtle shift, and we'll talk about that soon, but it is enough to make a difference. Despite the changes, these are still a 24 ohm IEM, and they've got a sensitivity of 103 decibels. So very easy to drive, not too difficult for your sources or your systems. They're not overly prone to hiss either. And so all in all, we've basically got the same looking and feeling IEM as the originals, just with a few tweaks. Speaking of tweaks, let's talk about a few things that are different. And the first thing to mention is that on the new version 2, on the inside of the nozzle once you pull off the tip, there's no grill now. Normally, any IEMs you would have seen will have a grill protecting any sort of wax or sweat getting into the drivers. And when I got these, I thought they were broken. I thought maybe when I pulled them out of the box, the grills had dropped out. So I reached out to TONEZZO and actually confirmed that these don't have grills out of the factory. And they've apparently done lots of testing to make sure that neither sweat nor wax from your ears will damage the drivers. Of course, if you're using them in a situation like if you're on stage or you're exercising with these, you may want to invest in some sort of IEM cleaning device like an IEM vacuum. But for most of us that are just using it in casual use, apparently they're completely safe to use this way, and it's actually improving the sound and improving the user experience. Another tweak coming from the version 1 to the version 2 is that we've now got a new cable. The old cable on the ones was completely fine, but this new one is just a little bit better. It's a softer cable. They had two versions on the old original ones. They had this quite thin one here, and they had a thicker Pro cable. I had a very early release pair of these IEMs, so I don't know which one was standard and if you had to pay extra for the upgrade cable. But I do know that with the new version of the ones, what you're going to get for your 550 odd Australian dollars is this newer cable, which is thicker than the old thin cable, and it's a lighter feeling and more supple feeling cable than the old Pro cable. And so this makes a really nice middle ground. It's a good feeling cable, it's nice and thick, nice and durable, it drapes really nicely over the ears and down around your shoulders or down behind your back if you're using it on stage. And then the other thing that's key about this cable is that in the 2-pin connectors up here, inside these, TONEZZO have actually built in a little resistor network or a crossover of some sort, and that's designed to tame some of the treble out of the ones. And that was really my issue with the originals, was they could get just a little bit hot in the treble. As I said before, I love them overall, but I did find that treble to be just a little bit bitey from time to time, and that's apparently what the Pro cable fixes. And we will talk about that when we get to sound quality, and we will get there soon. But again, before we get there, there's just a couple more things to mention. And that's for those of you that aren't familiar with the original ones, I just want to mention how well designed these are. They are such a wonderful feeling IEM. They're about as close to a custom molded IEM as you can get without getting a custom molding. They've got some really nice contours in the shell, a beautiful acrylic design, a fairly compact metal nozzle, and they give you some wonderful tips too. You can buy these tips separately as well. They're quite like SpinFit tips in the sense that they've got the pivoting nozzle and connection between the nozzle and the actual tip that goes in the ear. But on top of that, they're a softer silicone. Now, sometimes that's a problem for me because it doesn't actually push out and seal as well as I'd like. But on most IEMs, these are incredibly comfortable and very, very easy to fit. The final thing that I'll mention before we get into sound quality is one disappointment that I've got, and that is that just like the original ones, these are using what's called a QDC connector on the top. So it is a 2-pin connector, but it's the 2-pin connector where there's a protrusion from the body of the IEM, and that normally is meant to have a sort of recessed socket on the plug that goes over the top. However, in both the case of the Bluetooth module here and also the Pro cable, those are standard 2-pin connectors. And so what it means is that when you actually connect the 2-pin connector, like so, you're going to end up with quite a tall kind of loop sticking up and out of the IEM. It's not a big deal, it definitely isn't a deal breaker, but I would have liked to see them use the QDC connectors on the cables because I do think it's actually a more secure and more stable connector because the pins themselves are connected by an extra layer of plastic. It's a small thing, but I think it would have been a nice touch to see that. However, as I've already said, I'm a huge fan of the original ones, and I was so excited to put on the version 2 and see if those tweaks were significant, if they'd improved them, if they'd worsened them. That was my next question. And the very first thing I'd say is that the difference between the version 1 and the version 2 is pretty subtle. They're very, very similar IEMs. The version 2 is a little bit smoother, but it is still a bit bitey in the treble for me. I would have liked to see just a little bit more pulled back on the treble. The treble that's being delivered is a bit more refined than the version 1, so there's that going for it. But overall, I'd say the tonalities are quite similar. And interestingly, as you look at the graphs of the two, I think the version 2 is actually delivering a better sense of bass impact, even though the version 1 technically had more bass from a measurement point of view. And this is one of those cases where there's a lot more going on in an IEM, or a headphone for that matter, than just the frequency response. Things like the speed of decay, how quickly the sound drops off, how well notes are sustained, etc. All of that plays into the end result of what we perceive. And in the case of the version 2 of the ones, I know that's getting really confusing hearing that, but in the case of the version 2, I do think they've improved the overall presentation of bass. Even though they've pulled it back a bit, it hasn't become lean. And so for those of you that are not familiar with the version 1, and maybe this is the first time you've even heard about tones, let me tell you a little bit about how they sound in isolation without any comparisons. And the first thing I'll say is that the soundstage from these, again, is nothing short of amazing. I don't know what they've done over at Tones in the tuning and the construction of these, but they image as well or better than any other IEM I've tried. And I mean that in terms of the space they produce, the way they spread sounds around your head and make a soundstage that's outside of the head in many cases. They just do that incredibly well. As I've already said, I do find the treble from these just a little bit spicy, and in some ways they remind me of the Echo OH10. I think they're better than the OH10, but they're similar in the sense that they've got good presence in the bass, slightly hot treble, and a lovely sense of soundstage, but even better in the case of the ones compared to the OH10s. Their mid-range is full and weighty without ever feeling thick or overly rich or anything, and all in all their sound is just incredibly engaging. And that's very much true for what the original ones delivered, but it's even better now. I do find that some higher register vocals, like say a female vocal, somebody like Duffy, those can sound sometimes just a little bit sort of lacking in refinement, I guess you'd say. It can get a little bit forward, a little bit harsh, and I'm talking just a little tiny bit. And I raise that because it does show you that these are still a mid-tier and even a lower mid-tier IEM. They're not going to compete with your Sennheiser IE600, IE900, Beyerdynamics Lento 2s. They're not going to compete with those in terms of refinement, but in terms of enjoyment and engagement and just general presentation, there's nothing short of excellent. One final thing I'll mention about their tonality and frequency response is that I feel like the bass extension is just okay. They do roll off a little bit faster than I'd like, so those of you that are into electronic music and other genres that need deep, deep bass, these do start to roll off a little bit. It's not bad by any stretch, but I would have liked to hear just a little bit more, given that they've got that dynamic driver in there. And so overall, I'd say that tonally, they're an excellent IEM. I think their balance of tonality is fantastic. I think a little bit more refinement would have been good, but then you've got to put that into the context that these are essentially a $300 odd US IEM. And at that price, as I'll talk about in a comparison shortly, I think they're doing wonders. As I've already touched on, their imaging and their separation and soundstage is nothing short of phenomenal, particularly at the price. And I'd say that their detail retrieval and general technicalities are pretty good for the price point. Again, they're not going to compete with flagship level IEMs, but for what you're paying, they're doing a great job in all technical areas. And particularly in soundstage and imaging, they're phenomenal for what you're paying. Another nice touch with the ones is that they also perform really well across any genre I threw at them. They're great for classical because they've got that lovely sense of texture and detail from their treble, and also the body and the presence from the bass. And then they can also carry a groove as well if you listen to rock or blues or some funk, anything that needs that sort of drive and that rhythm, they've got that too. One area that they struggled just a little bit was that if you're listening for maximum timbral quality or tonal quality, things like violins, if you get a solo violin, it can sound just a little bit brittle at the top end on the ones version 2, but it's a minor complaint, and again, let's keep in mind that they're a mid-tier IEM. And so for where they're placed, I think they're fantastic again. And so at this point, I was really impressed with what I was hearing from the TONEZZO ONEz version 2. This was all, by the way, with the wired connection. And so let me give you a quick sense of what happens when you go from the wired to the wireless Bluetooth connection. If you're trying to work out what piece of gear you should buy next, then the Passion for Sounds Recommends database might be helpful for you. In the description box of every single video, just down here, you'll find the Passion for Sounds Recommends section. If you click on this link, it'll take you through to the Passion for Sounds Recommends Airtable database. What you'll see in here is every single product that I've ever reviewed and recommend, in some cases products that I own but maybe haven't reviewed but recommend. And then once you're in here, you can use the filter button up here to decide to filter by things like whether or not the product type is for a headphone, for example. So maybe you're looking for a headphone. Filter it by that and you can now see every headphone I recommend. You can sort it by price, which is the default sorting, or any other sorting method that you want. And then once you've got the list of products you're looking for, you've got the links to the reviews of the products, and then also purchasing links for global retailers and also regional retailers for the US, Australia, Canada, and the UK. So feel free to play around with this, sort it, filter it however you want to. It won't affect what anybody else sees, and you can hopefully find just the right products for you. I hope this is helpful, and now let's get back to the review. The Bluetooth module offers you everything you'd expect with a wireless headphone these days, and that means you've got high quality codecs like aptX HD. There's no LDAC on there, which is a little bit of a shame, but aptX HD is still very good. And they also give you controls so you can skip tracks, pause the playback, etc., and of course answer phone calls. I'm now speaking to you through the built-in microphone on the TONEZZO ONEz version 2 Bluetooth module, so hopefully this is giving you a good idea of what people can expect when they're talking to you. Comparing the wired connection to the wireless connection from a sound quality point of view, and one of the tracks I listened to for this was Benedictus by Two Cellos. Moving between the wired and the wireless, in some ways I think these are better with the wireless. Yes, you're going to lose a little bit of resolution because aptX HD is not lossless, but at the same time, the way they've tuned the Bluetooth module, what that's doing is it's actually smoothing out some of the harshness in the IEM, and it's bringing all of the benefits of the ones without some of their drawbacks. You lose a little bit of that treble sparkle and that treble energy, but as I've already alluded to, that results in a slightly smoother and more enjoyable tonality for me. And the great news is you don't lose any sense of that separation and that space in the soundstage. And that to me is really where these excel. It's that ability to produce that wonderful, immersive sense of space around you so you can just get lost in the music. And that's why for me, the wireless module is actually the way to go. It does make for what I think is probably the best wireless experience in terms of an in-ear that I've had to date. It's just so engaging, so enjoyable, so technically capable, and it makes all the true wireless that I've tried sound a bit like a toy. And I don't say that as a knock of the true wireless I've tried some fantastic ones, but these are just next level. This is actually bringing you as close as you're going to get, I think, to a wired experience in terms of IEMs, whilst giving you the convenience of wireless. Yes, it's not true wireless in the sense that you do have the band around behind your neck, but if you want the ability to disconnect from your phone or your DAP or whatever your source is, this is about as good as I've heard so far. And so for me, as much as I love them wired, I'm pretty sure these will be staying in wireless mode for me, using them as a Bluetooth only device, because they just sound so enjoyable and they give good isolation because of the in-ear design. There's no active noise cancelling, of course, but you kind of don't need it with an IEM. But having said that, what if you're looking at them as a wired IEM, or at least comparing them to wired IEMs? I thought this would be a good chance to have a look at some other IEMs that I had around and see what might stack up and maybe be better than the ONEz version 2. And I just received the Moondrop Blessing 3, they're priced pretty similarly, so I fired them both up to give them a comparison. Of course, I'll be doing a full review of the Blessing 3 soon, so make sure you subscribe and ring the notification bell for that one. But for now, to let the cat out of the bag a little bit, let me give you a comparison of the ONEz version 2 with the Moondrop Blessing 3. Listening to On the Serious Side by Tower of Power, and straight away, the treble from the ONEz was still just a little bit too spicy. This track isn't the best recording ever, and that's where the ONEz can get a bit aggressive. Having said that, the sense of separation of sounds and the sense of space in the soundstage was great, particularly with a large group like Tower of Power, where you've got all the different horns and the rhythm section and everything going on. These do a great job of separating it all out. One specific example of this is at about the 1 minute mark, there's a sax run within this track, and from the ONEz, it was just so beautifully separated from everything else in the mix. Not in an incoherent way, but it just popped forward of the mix. It was in its own place in space, and it just made it so easy to focus in on. And that's true for any of the little sort of runs and solos that you hear in an album like this. It's just so wonderful from the ONEz version 2 because they separate things out really well whilst keeping it coherent. Now I should flag that I was using the wired connection for this comparison, so I'm not comparing Bluetooth with wired here. I'm talking about both of these IEMs wired and connected to the Mojo 2. Moving over to the Moondrop Blessing 3, and it was still a little bit treble happy on this track, but it was definitely a smoother delivery than the ONEz. And I did start to wonder if maybe I was getting a little bit tired at this point, so I don't think either IEM is necessarily horrible for the treble. I think the Blessing 3 is probably going to be a bit more refined when I go back and listen with fresh ears. But the main thing for you to take away from this is that the ONEz version 2 is a more treble-happy earphone. The Blessing's a bit more refined in that regard. Now, whilst that might sound good, the other thing that it means is the Blessing 3 is a little bit less dynamic and engaging overall. It lacks some of the energy that makes the ONEz version 2 so enjoyable. And on top of that, I felt like the Blessing 3 was giving me nowhere near the sense of space and separation that the ONEz could give me. They did do a good job of highlighting vocals and kind of keeping the vocal well focused. But then sounds like that saxophone run that I mentioned before at about the 1 minute mark, that was kind of just lumped in with everything else. It wasn't cleanly and clearly separated in the way the ONEz did it. And so as I listened with the Blessing 3, everything was pretty much trapped inside my head, sort of up in the forehead region. Whereas when I went back over to the ONEz each time, everything was just kind of blown out, expanded out. I'm not talking HD800 kind of massive soundstage, but it is definitely a soundstage that goes beyond what you expect from most IEMs. And so to bring all this to a close, I'd have to say that I think the ONEz version 2 is an absolute winner. I think if you've got the original version 1 of the ONEz, I don't know that it's worth the upgrade. Maybe just go out and buy the Bluetooth module because it's lovely, or maybe connect them up to a different Bluetooth module. Let me know in the comments if people have tried that and how it sounds. But I think for me, if you're in the market for an IEM at about that $300 mark, you should absolutely check out the TONEZZO ONEz version 2. They're nothing short of phenomenal in my opinion at the price point, their technical performance, and also their ability to produce that sense of space, that sense of engagement, and the ability to immerse yourself in the sound is nothing short of exceptional. Of course, if you're completely allergic to treble, these might not be so good for you. But if you're like me, where you may be not a huge treble fan, but you're happy to deal with it if everything else is done just right, or maybe if you love treble, that's where I think the TONEZZO ONEz version 2 are fantastic. And by the way, just in case it's unclear, I'm not saying they're a treble-oriented earphone. I think tonally, they're very well balanced. They just have that extra bit of treble sparkle that can bite from time to time. That of course means they're going to vary from person to person depending on your ear canal shape and size and the tips you use. So if you do get a pair of these and you're finding them just a little bit edgy, then do play with some tips. Play with getting them deeper or shallower into the ear canal because it can make a massive difference. As I spoke about in my discussion of the fact that all IEM reviews are wrong, check out that video if you haven't seen it before. But I think that these are an IEM that I'm very comfortable recommending to pretty much anybody and everybody because I just think they're fantastic. So if you're in the market, you've got around $300 to spend, check them out. I don't think you'll be disappointed. And to be very clear, there's no affiliations between me and TONEZZO. I make nothing if you buy them. I just think they're a fantastic IEM. And so I hope you found this video useful, helpful, informative. Maybe I've introduced you to a brand you've never heard of before, and I hope you'll give them a go and check them out. And if you have found the video useful or helpful, I'd love it as always if you hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.